the last few weeks, we've been studying the life of Joseph. And if you remember from last week, we said this, that the Christian life is a transformational journey with Christ. In fact, we said that our vision as a church is to help every person take this transformational journey. That being a Christian is not just knowing some stuff, it's not just doing some stuff, it's not just being a good church member, but being a Christian is learning to follow Jesus. It's taking a transformational journey with Christ. In fact, say this with me, transformational journey with Christ. Let's say it again, a transformational journey with Christ. That's what it means to be on a Christian journey. And we want to help you in that journey. But like any journey, there can be some barriers in the way. Things that can cause us to get stuck in our journey. And God has so much out ahead for us. We want to remove those barriers. So today, I want to talk about what I believe is probably the biggest spiritual barrier in most people's lives. Now, for all of those that are kind of new this morning, I want to give us a little backstory. We're talking about Joseph. Joseph is the 11th of 12 sons born to Jacob. Now, over the next couple of weeks, these 12 sons will become the 12 tribes of Israel. So Joseph's number 11. He's the favored son and hated by his brothers. And so remember, his dad sends Joseph out to check on his brothers, and they betray him. They throw him in this pit. He ends up sold into slavery. He gets to Egypt, and Potiphar buys him. Potiphar's a man, the captain of the guard, a man of influence and power. And God is blessing Joseph. Everything he touches turns to gold. And Potiphar sees it and begins elevating Joseph. And in fact, eventually he puts him in charge of his whole house. And Potiphar's wife begins to notice Joseph. And she starts coming on to him, trying to seduce him. And Joseph pushes her away, but the truth is he kind of likes the attention. He puts himself in a vulnerable position, and she traps him. And when he runs away, she falsely accuses him of rape. And Potiphar, her husband, believes the story. And Joseph's thrown into prison. But even in prison, God begins to bless him and elevate him. And while he's in prison, he meets the former cupbearer of Pharaoh. And this guy has a dream, but God, remember, speaks to Joseph through dreams. And so when he has this dream, he tells it to Joseph, and instantly Joseph knows what the dream means and interprets the dream for the cupbearer, and sure enough, it comes to pass. Well, a little while later, the cupbearer's out of prison and working for Pharaoh again, and Pharaoh has a couple of strange dreams, and no one in Egypt can figure out what they mean. So he's called all the wise men and all the magicians and all the people that should know, and nobody knows, but the cupbearer remembers Joseph and tells Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh invites Joseph to come, and Pharaoh tells Joseph his dreams, and instantly Joseph knows what they mean. And says to Pharaoh, you're about to have 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. Therefore, in the 7 plentiful years, you need to save up and prepare for the famine. And if you'll save up, you can survive it. And Pharaoh hears his interpretation, hears his suggestion, and says, well, there's no one as wise and as intelligent as you. You ought to be in charge. And he makes Joseph the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. And that's where we pick up the story. This is Genesis chapter 42, beginning in verse 1. It says this, when Jacob, Joseph's father, heard that grain was available in Egypt, he said to his brothers, why are you standing around just looking at each other? I've heard there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy enough grain to keep us alive, otherwise we'll die. So Joseph's 10 older brothers went down to Egypt to buy grain. But Jacob would not let Joseph's younger brother, Benjamin, go with them for fear some harm might come to him. Now remember, when Joseph was sold into slavery, the brothers went home and reported to Jacob, your son Joseph, it appears, was attacked and eaten by a wild animal. And so Jacob now is a little overprotective. He's not allowing Benjamin to leave his side. And so the 10 older brothers go to Egypt to buy grain. Verse 5, so Jacob's sons arrive in Egypt along with others to buy food, for the famine was in Canaan as well. And since Joseph was governor of all Egypt and in charge of selling grain to all the people, it was to him that his brothers came. And when they arrived, they bowed down before him with their faces to the ground. And Joseph recognized his brothers instantly, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Where are you from? He demanded. From the land of Canaan, they replied. We've come to buy food. And although Joseph recognized his brothers, they didn't recognize him. And he remembered the dreams that he had when he was a little boy about them many years ago. And he said, you are spies, and you've come to see how vulnerable our land has become. So let me ask you a question. If you were in Joseph's shoes, what would you do? How would you treat your brothers? For 22 years, Joseph has suffered. He lost his father and his mother, all his brothers, all his cousins, all his nieces and nephews, his whole way of life. He lost his homeland. He lost everything. For years, he was a slave and then a prisoner, falsely accused. He has suffered greatly, and now he's the second most powerful man in Egypt, and his brothers are bowing in front of him. What should he do? What would you do? So he had the power right then to kill him. That's an option. He could throw him into prison. He could sell them as slaves. He could mistreat them. He could gloat over. He could say, how you like me now? Bow down. I told y'all. Kind of rub it in their face. What would you do? You know, the truth is, if Joseph did any of those things, we would all say, well, he was justified, right? I mean, his brothers did betray him. He did suffer greatly. They deserved to be punished. That was fair. What would you do? See, in this moment, Joseph holds their future in his hands. But you know what else? Joseph holds his future in his hands. Furthermore, Joseph holds redemptive history in his hands. And you know what? The same thing is true for you. See, the number one barrier often in our spiritual journey with Christ is unforgiveness. And in these moments, and they are powerful moments, in these moments, we hold someone's future in our hands. We hold our future in our hands. In fact, we hold redemptive history in our hands. So what do? We have to forgive. Now let's be honest about something. See, in church world, we're often kind of trite in our conversations about forgiveness. We say things like, well, you just got to forgive them. Or we say, forgive and forget. As if it's simple and easy. And the truth is, often forgiveness is complicated and very hard, right? So how do we learn to forgive? Why do we forgive? Where do we find the courage, the faith to do that? Because this is important, because remember in Matthew 6:12, Jesus instructed us to pray this way: Father, forgive us as we forgive those who trespass against us. In fact, there's a place where Jesus goes on to say that if we don't forgive, that we won't be forgiven. So serious. Jesus on the cross in Luke 23, he's being crucified and he prays, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So clearly we have a responsibility to forgive, but it's complicated and it's hard. So today I want to help us to understand forgiveness a little better so that we can move forward and forgive in order to cleanse our heart. Because listen, unforgiveness is like poison in your soul. Unforgiveness is like poison in your soul. And it affects all of your relationships. And today, man, we want to set our hearts free. Well, when you think about forgiveness, I read an article this week that was so helpful. It's written by Dr. Stephen Marmer. And he describes 3 different types or 3 different stages or 3 ways to understand forgiveness. So let me explain those to you. The first one is what he calls exoneration. And exoneration is what we typically have in mind when we think about forgiveness. He defines it this way. Exoneration is wiping the slate entirely clean and restoring a relationship to the full state of innocence that it had before the harmful actions took place. So in this case, when somebody has hurt us, we exonerate them, and from that point on, we begin to relate as if the offense never even happened. They've got a clean slate. Now the question is, when is it appropriate to respond that way? Well, certainly it would be appropriate to respond that way when the offense was an accident. So sometimes we do things, so for example, let's say we got a lunch date and I just blow it and forget and don't show up and you wait on me for 30 minutes. It's just an accident. I didn't intend to blow you off. I just forgot. I did something stupid. I didn't write it down. And in that case, exoneration of your pastor would be wonderful, right? Sometimes the issue is the person who's offended you as a child, or for whatever reason, they did not understand that their actions or behavior would affect you that way, would hurt you. In fact, this is probably the most common example in our friendships and in our marriages and with our kids. The person we love, they do something and it hurts us, it offends us. And the truth is, often they don't even realize they've done it. And so then you come to them and say, hey, I need to talk about something. And you begin to describe the situation from your perspective and how it made you feel. And they're kind of shocked. And often they say, I had no idea that would affect you that way, or that would hurt you, or you would see it that way. And I'm so sorry. And then they begin doing some very specific things that make exoneration possible. Number one, they take full responsibility. They don't make excuses. They say, man, you're right, I did it. Number two, they ask for forgiveness. And we know how to do that, don't we? Well, I better not assume. So let me make sure. Because often we think asking for forgiveness looks like this. I said I was sorry. That is not asking for forgiveness. That's basically saying, I don't want to talk about it anymore. Get out of my face is what that's saying. Asking for forgiveness is saying, will you forgive me for this, and naming the thing I did to you. That's what asking for forgiveness is. So taking responsibility, asking for forgiveness, and then saying, man, I don't ever want to do that again. And when someone responds that way to us, the truth is, it's pretty easy to forgive, isn't it? Right? When they take responsibility, when they ask for forgiveness, when they say, I don't ever want to do that again, well, it's pretty easy to forgive. And I think that's important for all of us to understand. When I think about me and Tina in 1997, we had this marriage crisis, and we talk about it all the time, probably more than you care to hear. But when I look back on that situation, Tina and I, in that moment, made a decision to forgive each other. We made a decision to take responsibility for our part in our conflict. We made a decision to ask for help so we could grow in our capacity to love one another. We took responsibility, we asked for forgiveness and pledged, man, I don't want you to feel that way anymore. We forgave each other and exonerated each other, and our relationship was restored as if it never had, and in fact, better than before. And that should be our desire when possible, and it's so important. I mean, just think about how important this is. If we had not forgiven, we probably wouldn't be married today. And think of the tragedy that would be. I mean, Tina would be married to a much poorer husband. I mean, just think how sad and unfortunate that would be. Just kidding. Think about my kids. My kids wouldn't exist today. Think about ministry. I probably wouldn't be in ministry today, which probably means definition doesn't exist today. And think about the impact the Definition Church has had on your life and spiritual journey. How unfortunate it would be if we didn't all have a church that was helping us to take a transformational journey, rather than just trying to make us good church members, because there's a difference, right? Do you see the power of these moments? When we handle them, when we navigate them well, everybody wins. Listen to this quote, it'll help. We judge others by their worst moments, but judge ourselves by our best intentions, don't we? Don't we? And let's be careful about that. Let's try to assume the best in others. Listen to these verses. Ephesians 1:7 says, in Jesus we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins. God has forgiven. Let's think about this. God has forgiven me a lifetime of sin. How ridiculous would it be for me not to forgive you for not writing my name on your calendar or some other silly thing, right? Proverbs 17:9 says this, I love it. Love prospers when a fault is forgiven, but dwelling on it, unforgiveness separates close friends. See, unforgiveness is corrosive to relationships. Ephesians 4:32 says this, be kind to each other, tenderhearted, forgiving one another. In fact, you know something we should go ahead and do? Let's just assume in any close relationship, that person that I love and I'm close to and care about, they're going to hurt me sometimes. It's unavoidable. But I want to be tenderhearted. I want to forgive each other. Why? Because Christ forgave me. Remember, our mission as a church is to be with Jesus, to become like Jesus, and then guess what? We start doing what Jesus did, which means we start forgiving one another as Christ has forgiven us. So the first category of forgiveness is exoneration, where the relationship is restored as if it never happened. But here's the second category, which I suspect is often what we're wrestling with. He calls it forbearance and defines forbearance this way. Forbearance is when the offender makes a partial apology or mingles their expression of sorrow with blame that you somehow caused them to behave badly. Come on, we've experienced a lot of this, right? Let me give you an example this week in my life. So Tina and I this week were in a counseling appointment, and we're having a conversation about a conflict we had a couple of months ago over a cell phone. And the conflict was this: when we go on a date, should we leave the cell phone in the car, or is it okay to take it in the restaurant? Now, I think we should leave it in the car. That way we can be totally focused on each other. Tina wants the cell phone so that she can be accessible to the children. I argue that the children can dial 911 and that for 6,000 years people didn't have cell phones. But Tina argues, do you not love our children? Right? So in that counseling session, as Tina is expressing her feelings, the thing I realize is she doesn't feel heard. In fact, she says the way you stay and give your opinion sometimes makes it feel like that my opinion, my perspective doesn't matter. Man, the last thing I want is for Tina to feel like her opinion or perspective doesn't matter. And so I just apologized, which did not go like this. I said I was sorry. But I said to her, I never want you to feel unheard. I never want you to feel devalued or disrespected. I want you to always know your opinion matters more than anybody else's opinion. I want to hear from you. So if I give my opinion in a way that makes you feel like I'm closed-hearted to your opinion, I'm not listening anymore to your perspective, I hope in the moment you'll just say, you're not listening, and help me catch myself, because I want to hear you well. And I'm sorry that you have felt that way, and I've caused you to feel that way, and I'll try not to do that anymore. That's pretty good, right? Then I said, however. So here's the other side of it. The reason I'm passionate about that issue is because our relationship's the most important relationship to me. And I think our relationship deserves some private, focused times. So there are some times in our relationship that I think we should be unavailable to the rest of the world. I think that's important. And in fact, I think the best thing we can give our children is a healthy relationship. And what contributes to a healthy relationship is if sometimes we're not available. And that gave Tina an opportunity to say, man, I can understand why that matters. And the truth is, I'm so glad to know that you're fighting for our relationship. So in our situation, we both had to take responsibility for our part in this conflict. And listen, when you're having conflict with the people that you love, generally speaking, there's some responsibility for both parties to take. There's some things for us both to learn. There's some things that we can both do better to love each other well. And that's what this forbearance is all about, is that we're talking about that and we're trying to navigate that together. So when conflict happens, you should ask yourself the question, what's my part in this conflict? In fact, I think Joseph, after 22 years of self-reflection, begins to realize, you know what? I was a mouthy brat. I did mistreat my brothers. I'm not surprised they threw me in that pit. And the truth is, it wasn't their fault that I was sold. And I think he's taken enough responsibility for his portion that it empowers him to relate to his brothers differently when they do show up. So I think we've got to ask ourselves that question. Secondly, I think we need to ask the question, how important is this relationship to us? And once again, I think Joseph has thought long and hard about that. I think Joseph misses his dad and his mom and his brothers and the extended family and his homeland and all the tradition. I think Joseph looks at all that and he goes, man, my family is more important than the conflict. And I would just say to you, so often we are fighting and destroying relationships over issues that are not nearly as important as the conflict. In fact, with my kids, there were times when they were little and they would fight. They don't really fight much anymore, but when they were kids, they would fight like all kids. And I would just say to them, listen, you're fighting and hurting each other over some dumb thing you won't even remember tomorrow. The relationship's lifelong. The relationship is so much more important than this silly little thing that y'all are mad at each other about right now. And that is generally true in your relationships. 5 years from now, things that you're fighting about tooth and nail, things that you're willing to sacrifice the relationship for, things that you're considering divorce over 5 years from now, you won't even be able to name. And I'm just telling you, the relationship is a higher value, so important. Now, in all of these cases of forgiveness, all that we're talking about, we all have a responsibility to let go of our bitterness and our fantasizing about revenge. Come on, don't we do this? Right? You're driving down the road and you're just imagining, if I run into him at Target, if I see her at Walmart, boy, I would just tell her, we're just giving it to them. We're letting them have it. And then they come back, oh man, I got one for that. And we're just slamming them in our mind, right? I'm gonna get them if the opportunity ever happens. And we've got to release our desire for them to hurt because we've hurt. Because that bitterness, again, it poisons our soul and is detrimental to all of our relationships. Now, forbearance also means, though, there's a degree of watchfulness. It's kind of a wait and see. It's like, okay, you've taken some responsibility, you've communicated some things to me. I've got to watch and see how we move forward. And together, we've got to rebuild trust. I think Jesus, for example, is doing this with Peter. Remember, Peter denies Christ. And then after the resurrection, Jesus comes looking to Peter to see how he'll respond. And when Peter sees him, he jumps in the water. Man, he's after Jesus, right? And then Jesus just pulls him aside and just says, hey, Peter, we got to talk about something. You said you would die for me. And what I need to know is, do you love me at all? Oh, right. I mean, he just puts his finger right on it. Peter said, oh, yeah, I love you. And he says, no. Look at me, Peter. Do you love me? Oh, yeah. No. Peter, do you love me? And Jesus is trying to get to the bottom of it so that there can be healing and restoration, and so that Peter can be exonerated, so their relationship can be restored. And so in forbearance, there's often a season of testing and waiting and seeing, and trust is growing. And hopefully one day exoneration will be possible. Now, what do I do though if a person continues to mistreat me? And sometimes in our relationships, in fact, this is what I probably hear about most often, is in a relationship when someone has offended someone over and over and over again, often for years. And they talk about it and it happens again. They talk about it and it happens again. And they're just at a loss. They're not sure what to do. And sometimes when that's true, you have to create a boundary. You have to understand what is in your yard and what you're responsible for and what is not. And you have to take responsibility for guarding your heart. Proverbs 4:23 says, for out of the heart flow the issues of life. And if we don't guard our hearts, what happens is in time, we lose the capacity to love. Because when our hearts are wounded over and over and over, they grow callous. They grow insensitive. They grow fearful, and then we're no longer willing to take risk. We're no longer willing to be vulnerable. And listen, you cannot love without being vulnerable and without taking some risk. So you have to have a soft heart. And the only way you can have a soft heart is for you to guard it. And the only person who will guard it is you. No one else can, no one else will guard your heart. Only you can do that. And sometimes we have to guard our hearts. Sometimes we have to create a boundary. Now, if this is a struggle for you, we don't really have time to unpack this in detail, but I would highly recommend the book, Boundaries. It's a Christian classic written by Henry Cloud, an amazing book. It'll help you understand how do I guard my heart so that I can continue to love. All right, here's the third and the final example, and that is what he just calls release. Release. And this is when the person who's hurt you or offended you, the truth is you cannot restore the relationship. You really don't have the ability to talk about it. They're not willing to talk about it. So for example, a great example would be, for a lot of us, we had some kind of childhood abuse. So I experienced sexual abuse in 5th grade. Only saw that person one time in my life. Bad experience. Never seen him since. Never will. There's no way for anything to happen except for me to release to Jesus the pain, the bitterness, the desire for revenge, the desire for that person to hurt or to suffer or to pay, but to give all of that to God and to release that, to let the poison out of my soul so it doesn't affect all my other relationships. And sometimes you're in that position, and it's so important because if you don't release that person, then your past has too big of a detrimental impact on your future. Listen to these two quotes. This is so powerful. He says this: release does not exonerate the offender. It doesn't require forbearance. It doesn't even demand that you stay in relationship, and often that's not even an option. But it does ask that instead of continuing to define your life in terms of your pain, that you release your pain in your preoccupation with negative things that happened to you in the past. I gotta trust God that He's redeeming my past and my pain to help me in my future rather than continuing to live there. Listen to this quote. This is so important to understand. He says, if you do not release the pain and anger and move past dwelling on old hurts and betrayals, you will be allowing the person who hurt you to live rent-free in your mind, reliving forever the persecution and the pain that the original incident created. In other words, if I don't release it, if I don't give it to Jesus, I'm still living it today. So I experienced abuse almost 40 years ago. But if I don't let that thing go, I'm experiencing the pain of that today. Well, that doesn't make any sense. And listen, that person doesn't have any power over me unless I hang on to that unforgiveness and bitterness. But if I can release the incident and release the pain and release the person to God, then it sets my heart free. Man, that is so important if I'm gonna be free. In fact, this is one of the great applications, I think, of James 5:16 that says this: confess your sin one to another and pray for each other that you might be healed. Some of us are carrying pain that we've never talked to anybody about. And one of the ways that we can be Christ to each other, one of the ways that we can do what Jesus did with each other, is to listen to our stories, to hear our pain and to empathize, not to fix it, just to be present with it, to assure this person of our love and understanding. And that moment gives me an opportunity to confess my unforgiveness that I've been carrying often for years and years and years, an offense. And the truth is, it's poison to my soul. So I want to confess my unforgiveness. And then I want to allow this person that I've taken into my confidence and I've shared this deeply personal situation, I want to invite them to pray for me. And that whole moment creates a powerful moment of healing and transformation and freedom, a fresh start. I'm not carrying it any longer. And for some of you today, there's some people you need to release, not for their sake, but for your sake, so that you can be free. Now, when we think about the story of Joseph, he seems to do all three, but in reverse order. Let me help you to see it. First, he releases his brothers. So remember, they were way back in Canaan. He's in Egypt. And I think there's a moment where he just gives it all to God. He's so grateful for his own forgiveness and grace that he releases his brother for their betrayal. You say, well, Alan, how do you know that? Because when they show up in Egypt, he doesn't kill them. Right? And if he'd have been fantasizing the whole time about his revenge, when they show up and bow down, right? It's like heads off. I'll show you. But he's beyond that. In fact, they come to get grain, and he's going to test them. So the forbearance begins to come into play. And he says, you guys go home and get your younger brother Benjamin. They told him that he had a younger brother. And he said, if you come back with Benjamin, I know you're telling the truth, but you're going to leave your brother Simon here behind. And he sends them home with their grain. And listen, he also sends them with all their money. So he gave them grain and he gave them their money back. So he's already blessing them. There's already goodwill in his heart towards his brothers, which means he's already released them before they ever show up. But he's also in this season of forbearance where they've got to build trust. He's trying to determine, are my brothers worthy of exoneration? Can our relationships be restored? Will they come back for Simon? Sure enough, a little while later, they come back. And Joseph releases Simon and he throws a big banquet. And at the banquet, listen to this, he gives Benjamin, he sees his younger brother, he gives Benjamin 5 times as much as all the other brothers. You know why? He wants to see how will they treat the favored son now. Are they trustworthy? Then he packs up their bags again with grain. And this time he hides his silver cup in Benjamin's sack. He tells them to go home, and they do. And then he sends his men. I want you to go and tell them, somebody stole my cup. And that's what they did. And the brothers say, listen, we would never do that. If anyone has your cup, that person will die. The rest of us will be slaves. They open the sacks, and Benjamin has the cup. Now, it was planted. This is all part of Joseph testing them because he wants to know, will they abandon Benjamin? Will they betray Benjamin? Will they turn their backs on Benjamin? But Judah, the same brother who threw Joseph in the pit. Well, God has redeemed that situation, not just in Joseph's heart, but in Judah's heart. And so Judah stands up and says, man, we cannot go back home without our little brother. He says, I made a promise to my dad I'd bring him home. So please let me stay. I'll be your slave the rest of my life. But let my little brother go free. Man, what a beautiful moment, right? And Joseph in that moment realizes, I can trust them. And in Genesis 45, he reveals himself. He sends everybody out of the room because he just begins to weep, and he says, I'm your brother Joseph, who you sold into slavery. And they're like, they're stunned. They can't speak. And Joseph said, but don't be afraid. For God sent me ahead of you to rescue you and to save you from starvation. What you intended for evil, God turned for good in the saving of many. Is that good? And that's the power of redemption. Watch this. If Joseph would have been unforgiving, he would have probably executed Judah, or at least thrown him into prison, right? Have you ever heard this verse? That Jesus is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. You know why it says that? Because Jesus was born into Judah's family. And in that moment, Joseph has no idea how big this moment is. He holds all of redemptive history in his hand. And I'm just telling you, in these moments in your life, you have no idea. You can't know how big they are. 10 years, 20 years, 40 years, 100 years from now. You have no idea the power of forgiveness to set you free and to set them free and to release redemption into God's creation. Isn't that good? So listen, today some of you need to release some people today. In fact, while I've been preaching, you've been thinking about those people. And I want to give you an opportunity to lead us through a simple prayer, to turn them over to Jesus, to turn over our bitterness to Jesus, to turn our unforgiveness to Jesus, and to invite His Spirit in this moment to begin healing our hearts and redeeming all of our pain. So I want to ask you just to close your eyes and to bow your heads with me. I want to invite you to ask the Lord right now. Just ask Him, who do I need to forgive? Who is it? And now that you got that person or people in mind, I want to lead you through a prayer. You can just pray it. You can pray it silently or softly, whatever you want to do. But let's pray it. You can pray after me. Dear Jesus, thank you for your forgiveness. God, the truth is I deserve judgment, where you've given me grace. God, you know my heart has been hurt. And I've been carrying bitterness, the pain, and unforgiveness for so long. So today I release to you this person. And just name the person, name the people. I release these people to you today. God, with it, I release all the pain. God, I release all the bitterness. I release all the unforgiveness. Jesus, heal my heart. Heal my pain. God, redeem my story. In Jesus' name.